Let's talk about an original combat account from the Indian Mutiny, resulting in a Victoria Cross award. Hey folks, Matt Easton here, Scholar Gladiatoris. As my regular viewers know, I love reading about the Indian Mutiny, also the Sikh Wars, the Opium Wars, all sorts of these kind of mid-19th century war campaigns that where essentially there was more likely to be hand-to-hand combat, because obviously I'm mostly interested in things like swords and bayonets and stuff. So we actually find in this type of colonial warfare, particularly in this mid-19th century context, there seems to be a larger degree of hand-to-hand combat for various reasons, partly due to the fact that they're still using muzzle-loading firearms, for example, partly due to the nature of the actual conflicts themselves, who the opponents were, things like that. But I've got this new book. I actually got it a while ago. I think I got it for Christmas, but I've only just started reading it because I always have several books on the go, so they have to kind of like work their way through. But it is called The Victoria Crosses That Saved an Empire, The Story of the VCs of the Indian Mutiny by Brian Best. And so far it's really good reading. It's really well written. It's not too clunky as a lot of historical books are. This one's pretty easy reading, and of course Victoria Crosses were something which inevitably connected with kind of daring do and kind of very extreme examples of combat, and many of them in fact involve hand-to-hand combat. Even if we look at the Victoria Crosses from World War I, for example, we see quite a lot of them involve hand-to-hand combat with bayonets and even swords in some cases. So, but the Indian Mutiny is famous for, well, many things, some pretty horrific things, and the author of this book is quite upfront about that there were atrocities, what we would class as war crimes, committed on both sides by the so-called mutineers, the rebels, essentially the Bengal Army rebels, and also by the British Army as well. And there were unfortunately lots of civilians kind of caught in the middle. Again, both Indian civilians and British civilians as well, many of whom were nothing to do with, you know, the military or military life, but nevertheless they got caught up in a war zone, just as people do in modern war zones. Nevertheless, without further ado, let's go to one account that resulted in a Victoria Cross. Obviously the whole book is full of examples of Victoria Cross winners, and this is of Henry Hartigan. So I'll just read the book and then I'll inject comments and observations as I go through it. So, born in Ulster, Henry Hartigan was about 31 years old and a sergeant in the 9th Lancers. So, being a sergeant in the 9th Lancers means that he had risen through the ranks. He would have joined as a trooper or a private. If you are in the cavalry, it's generally known as a trooper. If you're in infantry, it's generally known as a private. And to be a sergeant would suggest that he was held in quite high regard, probably very good at his job, maybe quite experienced as well. And 31 years old is a fair age as well. He probably joined when he was quite a bit younger, perhaps as young as 16, 17. As the British closed in on the village, the 9th Lancers became involved in a melee with the rebel cavalry. Hartigan saw that Sergeant Henry Helstone had been unhorsed and wounded. Despite being surrounded by enemy, Hartigan dismounted his horse, lifted Helstone onto his horse and carried him to safety. As with many VC citations, more than one act of bravery was listed in the VC citation. On the 10th of October at Agra, Hartigan was again responsible for saving a comrade's life when he ran to the assistance of Sergeant Cruz, who was being attacked by 4 rebels. Grabbing a tulwar from one of them with his right hand, he punched the sowar with his left. A sowar is an Indian cavalry trooper. Armed with the tulwar, he then turned on the other 3, killing 1 and wounding 2. In this action, Hartigan was dangerously wounded and was subsequently hospitalised at Agra for several months. So there's several interesting things going on there. Obviously, my regular viewers will know exactly what a tulwar is. It's one of these behind me, the most common type of Indian sword. Rebel sowars, so a lot of the rebel forces were made up of cavalry troopers who had mutinied, who'd rebelled against their officers, in many cases killing their officers. The officers were, you got Indian officers and British officers, but lots of the British officers and many British civilians were slaughtered in the first few weeks of the mutiny. the mutiny didn't all kick off at one point. It kind of there was a domino effect from different regiments, and many regiments didn't rebel, didn't mutiny, and in fact that's the important thing to point out, is that the mutiny, it wasn't a national uprising. I know that in India today it's often taught in schools as the first Indian War of Independence. I think that that's very historically inaccurate, firstly because it only affected Bengal, secondly because even in Bengal only parts of the Bengal army rebelled. Many Bengali civilians actually helped loyal forces and helped the British to hide and escape and this kind of stuff. And in the putting down of the mutiny, many of the people who put down the mutiny weren't necessarily British soldiers, they were Indian soldiers from other parts of India. And of course the Gurkhas from Nepal and Punjabi soldiers, mostly Sikhs, some Pathan soldiers from the northwest frontier and the Punjab. So I wouldn't call it an Indian War of Independence. It was a rebellion. It was a rebellion of part of the Bengal army, supported by some Bengal civilians. Right. So moving on. So a cavalry trooper could have a tulwar or could have a regulation cavalry sabre. They had both at that point. But there is some suggestion, I've got some hint of it, that in some cases when they rebelled, they chucked away their government issued weapons and went back to their native tulwars, probably because they preferred them. Right, so he was wounded for several months and hospitalised at Agra. By the end of the year there was a need for more mounted troops, and Hartigan, now recovered, was offered an NCO position with a newly raised irregular cavalry unit called Meade's Horse. 100 Sikhs, this is important to note, 100 Sikhs and Punjabi Mohammedans formed the nucleus of the regiment. Now that's noteworthy because Sikhs, generally speaking, at that point didn't sympathise with the Hindus and Muslims in the Bengal army that had mutinied. Also, 10 years before, the Sikh lands in the Punjab had been invaded, in fact a number of times, during the Sikh Wars, and most of the soldiers who were under British command who invaded the Sikh empire were Hindus and Muslims. So to a certain degree it has been suggested, and I think it's fairly convincing, that 10 years later the Sikhs actually saw this as an opportunity to kind of get their own back on the forces essentially centred on Delhi, because those forces 10 years earlier had invaded their land under British officers nevertheless, but still I think there was a bit of a grudge there. Punjabi Mohammedans, that essentially means Muslim people from the Punjab. In some cases they may well have been what we'd now term as Pathans or Afghans. And certainly Pathans, Afghans formed a notable part of many of the forces which were raised in response to the mutiny to suppress the mutiny further south. A typical British tactic at the time was taking people with a grudge from one area to fight the people from this area. So, it's just what the Roman Empire did as well. Most successful empires have done similar things. So 100 Sikhs and Punjabi Mohammedans formed the nucleus of this regiment, to which were added different religious groups and loyal members of disbanded native regiments. By the end of January 1858, Meade was able to split his multi-faith force into 6 separate troops. It was Hartigan's task, so this is the main guy we're looking at here, it was Hartigan's personal task to teach these recruits to ride, care for their mounts, as well as handle their weapons on horseback. Now, I would say, I strongly suspect that actually Hartigan's job was fairly easy on that front, because presumably the people they'd recruited already knew how to ride, they already knew how to look after their horses, and they already knew how to use weapons. However, if we look at Nolan's work, Nolan of the Charge of the Light Brigade, there is a suggestion that in India they were teaching Indian cavalry recruits the regulation cavalry sword exercise and riding exercises. And he sort of criticises this because he says, look, they already know how to do it, so what's the point forcing them to do it in the British way when they can do it very well in the Indian way, which is what the irregular cavalry did. Anyway, moving on. By March, when they were proficient enough, they joined Brigadier M.W. Smith's brigade, the Rajputana Field Force, as they campaigned throughout 1858 in central India. So after the mutiny had been more or less put down, there were still ongoing campaigns. For anybody who collects guns out there, you'll note that if you want to buy an antique relic condition usually, but an antique Enfield rifled musket or the 1842 musket, a lot of them come from Nepal, and one of the reasons for that is partly because the Nepalese cached them in their armoury and stored them and covered them in grease, and that's why they survived. But many of those seem to have come from mutineers who were fleeing India in the front of government forces essentially pursuing them. So lots of these rebels kind of ran away to the extremities of the region of Oud, for example, the Oud campaign, ran to the edge of Oud and in some cases left India. So there was lots of campaigning after the mutiny had officially ended. At the conclusion of the mutiny, Hartigan was gazetted on the 19th of June 1860 and received his Victoria Cross from Lady Hersey at Fort William in Calcutta on the 24th of December 1860. He was subsequently commissioned as a lieutenant in the 16th Lancers, which was stationed at Bangalore. So that's quite notable. So he was, he was in his 30s by this point, mid-30s practically, and he had been a private soldier, then an NCO, and then very unusually, because he'd won the Victoria Cross and obviously really impressed his superiors, he was commissioned as a lieutenant. That means he made the jump from ranks to commissioned officer, and that is, in this period, that is a really exceptional thing. And anybody who watches or reads Bernard Cornwell's stories about Sharp will know that's what happened to Sharp, but he supposedly saved Wellington's life to achieve that. And that is the kind of, in this period, you've got to really, really impress people to make that social jump, essentially from working class to gentry, to gentleman. When you become an officer, you become a gentleman. And actually it was very expensive to buy all the officer's stuff and live the life of a gentleman. So it could be a double-edged sword, as it were. It could be a bit of a pain in the butt, but presumably they had a choice and they could say no thanks and leave the army if they wanted to. But anyway, it's very impressive that he was commissioned as a lieutenant. Very, very rare in the British Army at this time. In 1877 he wrote a book snappily entitled Stray Leaves from a Military Man's Notebook, containing descriptions of men and things regimentally at home and abroad. I need to procure this and read it because I'm sure it'll be very interesting reading. Henry Hartigan died in Calcutta on the 20th, so he died in India, eventually lived there his whole life. Died on the 29th of October 1886 at the age of 60. When you think how much he achieved, 60 is not really a grand old age to live to, is it? So I hope all of my viewers live further than 60. But so there we go, a very interesting case. Also, going back to the original tale, it's notable that he grappled someone who was using a tulwar. We see a parallel to this in Hodson's own accounts of his experiences, and in fact there are independent witnesses to this. He wrestled, grappled, disarmed a tulwar off an opponent as well. So whilst grabbing swords is not dealt with in the 19th century swordsmanship sources very much, it is here and there, it very clearly was done in actual combat. And you do what works when it comes to actual fighting. And I've always lamented that one of these people who actually saw action, who actually did these things, didn't write a treatise or a manual down with their advice based on real combat. And it's a great shame that didn't happen. The closest we have to it is Colonel Fox. Colonel Fox, who used his sword at the Battle of Tel el-Kebir. I actually own one of his swords, but not the one he used at Tel el-Kebir, unfortunately. And he didn't write a treatise, but he did commission Ferdinand Masiello, the Italian fencing master, to make a treatise. Ironically, that is a very Sal fencing, a very classroom fencing system, and is not at all what I'd recommend someone to use on the battlefield. Maybe Colonel Fox felt differently. But there we go, there's another first-hand historical account, or in this case actually secondary and tertiary source, descriptive account of combat, in this case during the Indian Mutiny. For my next one, I'll try and find a different period and a different place. Cheers folks. Thank you for watching. Please subscribe, follow us on Facebook. You can buy t-shirts through Spreadshirt, support us on Patreon, or follow us on Pinterest. Thank you.